Okay, page 26 is your warm-up today. We're gonna need all of this algebra techniques for our lesson because we're gonna solve trig equations. So now we're gonna combine solving and our identities into one problem, which is why your homework last night was to fill out the unit circle. We're gonna pause the video. We will give you 3 minutes to solve these 4 problems, and then we will keep going and check our answers. So this factor is what multiplies to 4 that adds to -4 is going to be -2 and -2. And then we are going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve when we get x equals 2 and x equals 2. For this one, there's nothing to factor. You have to add the 1 to the right and divide by 2. And then we'll square root both sides, but you have to be careful. When you square root both sides to solve, you need plus or minus. And then we can simplify. The square root of 1 is 1, and we have root 2 on the bottom. And you can leave your answer like that. C is the difference of 2 perfect squares, so we're gonna factor to conjugates. So we get x plus 5 is 0, x minus 5 is 0, and solving each one, those are our answers. Now D is tricky because of this 2 leading coefficient. So I'm gonna use box method to factor. 2 times 1 is 2. The only way to multiply to 2 is 1 times 2, and that adds to 3, which is good. 2x squared and 1 go in the top left and bottom right. This 1 and 2 I'm going to use to rewrite 3x. So now it's a puzzle. What multiplies to 1 is just 1 and 1. So they go on the outside. And then to get the other boxes, something times 1 is 2x is 2x. 2x times, something is 2x squared, so that's x. So our factors are 2x plus 1 and x plus 1. So 2x plus 1 equals 0. And solving each of these, we get -1/2 and -1. Okay, so the reason we need all that algebra is because now we are going to find these exact solutions from 0 to 2 pi. Sorry, you can't see that. We're going to find exact solutions from 0 to 2 pi. But now instead of just x, we have sine x or cosecant or cosine squared. Depending on how your teacher explained it first semester, we all have different ways of solving the trig equations. I like to use my special right triangles and these pictures. Some teachers use the unit circle, so you can pick whatever way you like to solve. You just have to be confident in the way that you're solving. Okay, so here's how we're gonna do number 1. I'm gonna add 1 to the right, divide by 2. So now this is saying, where is sine positive 1/2? Well, sine is positive in the first quadrant and the second quadrant. And it equals 1/2, so opposite the 1 is pi over 6. That's this first quadrant. In this quadrant, we're gonna have 5 pi over 6. For number 2, I'm gonna add the 2 to the right, divide by 2. So cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. And if I reciprocal 1 over 1, I still get 1. So this is saying, where is sine positive 1? Well, I forgot to write on my pictures here. For the unit circle, this point is over 1 and up 0. This point is over 0 and up 1. So sine is the y value, and that's positive 1 at pi over 2. For 3, to solve, I'm going to factor out the secant squared common factor. I'm going to keep factoring this difference of squares to the conjugate. So that's going to give me secant x plus 2 and secant x minus 2. I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. When we square root both sides here, we get secant of x is 0. Subtract the 2 and add the 2. And then, okay, so secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So if I think of all these reciprocals, well, is cosine ever undefined? No, so that's going to give us no answers. So now we've got plus and minus 1/2. So when is cosine 1/2? Adjacent for cosine to the 1 is pi over 3. And I now want pi over 3 in every quadrant since I need positive and negatives. And here's our 4 answers to number 3. For number 4, I'm going to add the 1 to the right, divide by 2, and square root. The square root of 1 is 1. We'll leave the square root of 2. So now this is saying for what angle will we get positive or negative 1 over root 2? So here, cosine with the root 2 is going to be pi over 4. And then I need pi over 4 in every quadrant. If you're unsure about how I'm getting all the other answers with the reference angle, we think of 0 and pi with a common denominator. So with our pi over 4, this is 4 over 4. Oh, sorry, this is supposed to be 2 pi. And then that's going to be 8 pi over 4. So a little less is 3 pi over 4. A little more is 5 pi over 4. And then a little less than 2 is the 7 pi over 4. Okay, in 5, I can never ever divide by sine, cosine. You can never divide by a function. So the only thing to do here is to add the sine x to the left. Now we have 2 sine x's. And then I'm going to subtract the root 2 and divide by 2. Well, negative root 2 over 2 is another form of 1 over root 2. But I only want negative. So sine is negative in the 3rd quadrant and 4th quadrant. So using my special triangles, that angle will be pi over 4. But in the 3rd quadrant, that's 5 pi over 4, and in the 4th quadrant, 7 pi over 4. And then for 6, I'm going to add 1 to the left, divide by 3, square root both sides, and then we want plus or minus, so I'm going to have 4 answers because I need every tangent quadrant. And back to my pictures. So tangent is opposite over adjacent. So I want to figure out which which angle gives me opposite and adjacent with these sides. So opposite the 1 is pi over 6, and that's adjacent to root 3. So pi over 6 is going to get me all of my answers. A little less than 1, a little more than 1, and a little less than 2. All right, on the back, page 28. Some of these problems are duplicated in your homework. Sorry, this is page 28. I'm not going to do number 2, that's in your homework. I'm gonna skip number 4, because see how it says 2x? That's a really special situation, and we can do that tomorrow or the next day. We're gonna be spending 3 days on solving, so we'll come back to number 4. Don't cross it out, we'll come back to that. Number 5 is on your homework, so let's finish with 6 and 7 on this page. I'm gonna add root 3 to the right. Divide by 3. And I don't like cotangent. Let's think of tangent. Root 3 over 3 came from 1 over root 3, so when I take the reciprocal, I get root 3 over 1. So opposite and adjacent. Opposite of root 3 is pi over 3. And then I need the quadrant that tangent is positive in, which is down in the third. So that is going to be 4 pi over 3. And 7 we're going to factor. You can think of this with just w's or any letter you want. Just don't pick x. So we can factor just like the warm-up. 2 times -1 is -2. So to add to -1, I need the 2 to be negative. Fill in my box for box method. So I'll do -2w and 1w. So since these are the negative, this column will be negative and this row is positive. So that this is w and this is 2w. So my factors, well, instead of w, I'm going to use sine. Is sine x minus 1 and 2 sine x plus 1. I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. Isolate the sign. So where is sine positive 1? That's at pi over 2. Where is sine -1/2? So opposite of 1 is the pi over 6. But I need the negative sign quadrants because of the -1/2. So that's the bottom two, the third and fourth. So that's 7 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. So there's our 3 answers. Okay, so this last page on 29, we're actually going to use our calculator because it says to the nearest 10th of degree. So take out your calculator. We're going to make sure we're in degree mode. And to solve this, we're going to use the inverse button. And all of the sine, cosine, tangents have these blue, or depending on your color. So if I do second cosine of 0.65, it gives me the first angle. So x is 49.5 degrees. However, I need both places that cosine is positive. So I have to use this reference angle in the fourth quadrant. So I'm going to do 360 minus that reference angle and get 310.5 degrees. So these are our 2 answers. For number 2, before we can start solving, I have to get the cosines together and the constants together. So I'm going to subtract the 5 cosine x to the left. Subtract this 3 to the right. Divide by 3. And now in the calculator, cosine inverse of 2/3 gives me 48.2 degrees. But cosine is positive in the first and fourth quadrant, so I have to use that as a reference angle and get 311.8 degrees for the other angle. And then for 3, we're going to divide by 5. Square root. Plus or minus, because we square rooted both sides, so let's see what that is. 1.897, and so on. Don't round this, because now watch, I'm going to do second tangent. I'm going to get the inverse tangent of, and then if you do second negative, it brings up the answer. So it will take this whole decimal and paste it in for you so that you get the most exact degrees. From here, because it's plus or minus, we want every quadrant. So I'm going to have 4 answers. The second quadrant is 180 minus 62.2. The third quadrant is 180 plus 62.2. And the fourth quadrant is 360 minus 62.2. And there's our 4 answers. Your homework is all of page 31, just page 31. I am going to scan my answers so that they are in Drive for you to check yourself.